power in authoritarian systems does not transfer peacefully, it does not transfer predictably, and it does not transfer without consequences that ripple outward from the specific geography of the succession struggle into the broader regional and global environment in ways that no planning document, no intelligence assessment, and no diplomatic framework fully anticipates. When the man at the top of an authoritarian system, the man whose person embodies the system's legitimacy, whose decisions have been the organizing principle of an entire state's foreign and domestic policy, whose presence has been the one constant around which every other element of the political architecture has been constructed. When that man's health crashes, the world does not simply wait politely for an orderly transition. It holds its breath, it recalculates, it prepares for the specific category of dangerous uncertainty that succession crises and nuclear-adjacent authoritarian states generate. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei's health has crashed. Not deteriorated gradually in the manageable way that aging leadership transitions sometimes allow for careful preparation and managed succession. Crashed, suddenly, severely, in a way that has sent the Iranian political establishment into the specific kind of controlled panic that looks, from the outside, like business as usual, but that every insider within the system recognizes as the activation of contingency plans that were always maintained in the background, but that nobody wanted to see go live. The information environment around Khamenei's health has always been one of the most tightly controlled in the world. The Islamic Republic treats the supreme leader's physical condition as a matter of state security. Information about his health is filtered through a security apparatus that understands that uncertainty about leadership succession is itself a strategic vulnerability that adversaries will exploit and that internal factions will use to advance their own positions. And what reaches the public, through the carefully managed communications of Iranian state media, is always sanitized, always reassuring, always calibrated to project the image of a leader whose physical presence is as durable as his ideological authority. The fact that what is now being reported, not just through the exile media and the opposition networks that have always generated skeptical assessments of Khamenei's health, but through the specific behavioral signals of the Iranian state itself, through the patterns of elite political activity and the specific movements of key institutional actors that intelligence analysts track as indicators of succession preparation, the fact that these signals are converging in ways that cannot be explained by routine health management is the story. The signals are real. The convergence is happening. And the implications of what comes next for Iran, for the region, for the nuclear program that sits at the center of every calculation about Persian Gulf security, and for the broader strategic environment that Khamenei's 4-decade grip on power has shaped, are the implications that the world needs to understand before the succession crisis reaches its acute phase. Let's establish what is actually known, what is credibly sourced, and what is assessed from behavioral indicators, because the honesty that this story requires means being scrupulous about the difference between documented reality and analytical inference, and the significance of what is happening is sufficient to make that precision necessary rather than merely academic. What is documented is that Khamenei's public appearances have become significantly less frequent, shorter in duration, and more carefully controlled in their staging than at any previous period of his 35-year tenure as supreme leader. The specific physical indicators visible in his most recent public appearances, the visible weight loss, the pallor, the apparent difficulty with sustained standing, that has been accommodated by the provision of seating that was not previously a feature of his public addresses, the shortened duration of speeches that were previously characteristically extended, are observable to anyone watching the available footage and constitute a pattern whose interpretation by medical professionals with expertise in reading clinical indicators from public appearances is consistently in the direction of significant deterioration. What is credibly sourced from the multiple Iranian dissident networks, former regime insiders, and regional intelligence contacts that cover the Iranian political system is that the specific health crisis that has precipitated the current alarm within the Iranian establishment involves a recurrence of the prostate cancer that Khamenei was reportedly treated for in 2014, and that the recurrence has progressed to a stage that the medical professionals within the restricted circle of those managing his care are treating with the urgency of a condition that is no longer simply chronic but acute. What is assessed from behavioral indicators, from the specific patterns of elite political activity that intelligence analysts track as the most reliable indicators of succession preparation in opaque authoritarian systems, is that the key institutional actors within the Iranian power structure have shifted from passive succession awareness to active succession positioning. The behaviors that distinguish these two modes are specific and observable. Passive succession awareness is the condition in which elite actors understand that succession will eventually be necessary and maintain informal awareness of factional alignments and potential candidates without taking actions that could be interpreted as disloyal to the incumbent. Active succession positioning is the condition in which elite actors begin taking specific steps, building coalitions, securing institutional commitments, cultivating relationships with the Revolutionary Guard commanders whose support will be decisive in any succession process, that are designed to shape the outcome of the transition rather than simply to be well positioned for it. The behavioral indicators of active succession positioning are now present among key Iranian elite actors in ways that passive succession awareness does not explain. The specific pattern of meetings, the specific communications among figures in the Assembly of Experts, the body whose formal constitutional responsibility includes selecting the next supreme leader, and the specific movements and positioning of Revolutionary Guard commanders, who understand that their institutional future depends on backing. The right successor have all shifted in ways that analysts with experience reading Iranian political dynamics are interpreting consistently as preparation for an imminent transition. Now let's understand who Khamenei is, what his departure means, and why the specific character of his leadership has made him so difficult to replace in ways that go beyond the personal and into the institutional. Ali Khamenei became supreme leader in 1989 in circumstances that were themselves less than ideal for a smooth transition. He was elevated from the presidency to the supreme leadership after the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, the revolutionary founder, in a process that required the revision of the constitution to accommodate his relatively modest clerical credentials. Khomeini had been the grand Ayatollah whose religious authority was matched to his political power in a combination that gave the Islamic Republic its foundational legitimacy. Khamenei was never his equal in either religious scholarship or the specific charismatic authority that Khomeini's generation of revolutionary clerics carried. His authority has rested on a combination of institutional position, political shrewdness, and the specific management of the Revolutionary Guard's loyalty that has been the practical foundation of supreme leader authority in the post-Khomeini period. Over 35 years, Khamenei has transformed the position from one of revolutionary authority grounded in religious legitimacy into one of institutional authority grounded in the specific network of relationships, obligations, and mutual dependencies that he has constructed among the Revolutionary Guard, the intelligence services, the judiciary, the economic foundations controlled by the Supreme Leader's office, and the religious establishment. He is not loved by these institutions in the way that a genuinely charismatic leader is loved. He is needed by them, and they by him, in the specific way that a patron-client network needs its patron. The departure of that patron creates a problem that is not simply about finding a new individual to fill the position. It is about reconstituting the entire network of relationships and obligations around a new center, a process that generates competition, that reveals the tensions among factions that Khamenei's presence has been managing, and that creates the specific window of vulnerability that authoritarian succession crises always create. The candidates who are being positioned and positioning themselves for the succession represent genuinely different visions of what Iran should be and where it should go. Understanding those differences is essential for assessing what the succession means for Iranian foreign policy, for the nuclear program, and for the regional strategic environment. The most prominent figure in the succession calculations is Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader's son, whose political profile has been carefully managed to avoid the appearance of dynastic succession that would violate the Islamic Republic's republican pretensions, while simultaneously being positioned within the Revolutionary Guard networks and the institutional structures that matter for succession in ways that reflect unmistakable preparation. Mojtaba Khamenei is not a religious scholar of the standing that the position formally requires. He is a political operator whose connections within the Revolutionary Guard and whose access to the networks of loyalty and obligation that his father has built over 35 years give him a form of succession capital that formal credentials alone cannot provide. His elevation would represent a consolidation of the most hardline, most Revolutionary Guard-centric, most anti-Western orientation within the Iranian political establishment, a continuation of his father's trajectory in its most inflexible and most confrontational form. It would represent the explicit militarization of supreme authority that the Revolutionary Guard commanders, who are the most influential actors in the succession process, would find most congenial. And it would represent the specific rejection of the reformist and pragmatist currents within the Iranian political system that have periodically sought to moderate the Islamic Republic's domestic repression and international confrontation. The alternative candidacy that represents the most genuinely different vision comes from the clerical establishment centered on Qom, the traditional religious scholars, whose authority derives from the specifically religious dimension of the supreme leader position that Khamenei has maintained nominally but increasingly hollowed out in practice. A successor drawn from this establishment, a figure of genuine religious scholarly standing whose authority would re-anchor the position in its theological rather than its political dimension, would represent a different relationship between the Supreme Leader's office and the Revolutionary Guard, one in which the Guard's operational autonomy would be more constrained, and in which the specifically religious legitimacy of the position would need to be reconstructed through actual clerical authority rather than political power. This path is more likely to produce a figure open to some accommodation with the outside world, not because religious scholars are inherently moderate, but because the specific sources of legitimacy that a genuinely clerical supreme leader would need to cultivate are different from the sources that a politically grounded figure relies on, and those different legitimacy requirements create different incentives for domestic and international behavior. The Revolutionary Guard itself, the institution whose loyalty is the decisive factor in any succession outcome, is not monolithic in its preferences. Different Guard commanders have cultivated different relationships with different potential successors, and the internal power dynamics of the Guard in the succession period will be as consequential as the formal deliberations of the Assembly of Experts. The Guard commanders understand that the succession is their moment of maximum leverage, that their institutional future, their specific operational autonomy, and the specific economic interests that Guard-affiliated entities have accumulated over decades of privileged access to the Iranian economy are all at stake in who becomes supreme leader. Their collective calculation about which candidate best serves their institutional interests, and the specific process by which that collective calculation is reached among commanders, who are themselves competing for position within the post-transition Guard hierarchy, is the most important and the least transparent element of the succession process. Now let's look at the nuclear dimension, because Khamenei's health crisis is arriving at a moment in the Iranian nuclear program's development that makes the succession question more consequential for global security than it would have been at almost any previous point in the program's history. Iran's nuclear program has advanced to a level that independent assessments from the IAEA, from Western intelligence services, from the specific technical indicators that the monitoring regime for Iranian nuclear activities generates, place it closer to nuclear weapons capability than at any point since the program was revealed to the international community in 2002. The specific technical metrics, the enrichment levels being maintained, the stockpile of highly enriched uranium that has been accumulated, the centrifuge capacity that has been installed and operated, and the weaponization research whose dimensions are assessed from various intelligence channels, all point to a program that is weeks or months away from producing enough weapons-grade material for a first device if the political decision to do so were made. That political decision, the decision to cross the threshold from nuclear capability to nuclear weapons, is exactly the kind of decision whose dynamics are most affected by leadership succession. Under Khamenei, the nuclear program has been maintained in a specific posture, advancing technical capability while maintaining strategic ambiguity about weapons intent, using nuclear progress as a source of leverage in international negotiations, keeping the final decision about weaponization as a reserved option rather than an activated program. This posture has reflected Khamenei's specific calculation about the costs and benefits of nuclear weapons, a calculation shaped by his 35-year experience managing the relationship between Iran's nuclear ambitions and the international community's responses to those ambitions. A successor comes to that decision without 35 years of accumulated experience managing that specific relationship. A successor comes to it in the specific context of a succession that has itself generated international attention, and that may have been accompanied by internal demonstrations of strength and commitment to the program's continuation that constrain the flexibility available to modify the posture. And a successor comes to it in an international environment that has been watching the succession crisis and recalibrating its own policies in response. Policies that may themselves have moved in directions that make the original Khamenei posture less viable as a continued approach. The most dangerous scenario in the succession context is not the scenario in which a hardline successor immediately decides to weaponize, though that scenario cannot be excluded. The most dangerous scenario is the one in which the succession crisis itself creates a miscalculation spiral, in which internal Iranian political dynamics, specifically the need of a new supreme leader to demonstrate strength and command authority to the Revolutionary Guard commanders, whose support is the foundation of the new leadership's legitimacy, creates incentives for nuclear demonstrations that are not primarily about the international nuclear equation, but about domestic political signaling, in which outside actors, Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, misread those internal political signals as externally directed threats and respond in ways that accelerate the confrontation that everybody says they want to avoid. This is the specific danger of the Khamenei succession, not the danger of a clearly hostile actor making a clearly hostile decision, but the danger of a complex internal political process, generating external signals that are misinterpreted in an environment where the margin for misinterpretation is extremely thin. Israel's response to Khamenei's health crisis is being managed through exactly the combination of public silence and intense private preparation that has characterized Israeli policy toward Iranian leadership transition scenarios throughout the period of their strategic confrontation. Israeli military planners have been developing contingency plans for exactly this kind of Iranian succession scenario. Scenarios in which the combination of leadership uncertainty and nuclear proximity creates windows of vulnerability in the Iranian decision-making process that might be exploited, or windows of danger that might require preemptive military action to prevent outcomes that Israeli strategic doctrine treats as existential threats. The specific Israeli calculation about whether to take military action against Iranian nuclear facilities, a calculation that has been maintained in a state of continuous readiness throughout the years of diplomatic negotiations and strategic standoffs that have characterized the Iran-Israel confrontation, is more acute during a succession crisis than at any other time. The uncertainty about who will be making Iranian decisions, about what those decisions will be, and about whether the normal deterrence relationships that have governed the confrontation will be maintained by a new leadership whose commitments and calculations are unknown, creates a specific Israeli strategic anxiety that is the direct analog of the international anxiety that any nuclear-armed state's leadership succession generates. The Saudi response is equally significant and equally intense in its private dimension, however carefully managed the public presentation. Saudi Arabia has the most direct and most immediate exposure to any change in Iranian strategic behavior that flows from the succession. The specific Iranian activities that threaten Saudi interests, the Houthi military capability in Yemen that Iranian support sustains, the networks of influence in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria that Iranian strategic posture enables, and the nuclear program that the Saudi-Pakistani deterrence framework has been partly constructed to address, are all potentially affected by who becomes supreme leader and what strategic priorities that person brings to the position. The American response involves the specific institutional challenge of a government that is simultaneously managing multiple simultaneous crises in multiple theaters while confronting a leadership succession in an adversary state that affects the nuclear proliferation question, the Gulf security architecture, the specific sanctions and diplomatic frameworks that have been the primary American instruments of engagement with the Iranian nuclear program, and the broader regional security environment that American military presence in the Gulf is supposed to help stabilize. American contingency planning for Iranian succession scenarios is extensive. The specific scenarios have been wargamed and assessed and documented in the classified planning infrastructure of the American national security establishment. But the gap between planning and reality in succession crises is consistently larger than planners estimate, because the specific human, institutional, and political dynamics of authoritarian succession are resistant to the systematic analysis that planning documents impose on them. China's stake in Iranian succession is different from the American and Israeli stakes, but is significant in ways that are not always visible in public discourse. China's comprehensive partnership agreement with Iran, the economic relationships that make Iran a significant component of China's energy, import portfolio, and Middle East engagement strategy, and the specific Chinese interest in maintaining a stable Iran that is available as a partner in Chinese strategic competition with the United States. All of these are potentially affected by a succession that produces a significantly different Iranian strategic orientation. Beijing's preferred succession outcome is the one that produces the most stable and the most internationally engaged Iranian leadership. Not because China wants Iran to become a Western partner, but because Chinese strategic interests in Iran are served by an Iran that is functional, economically engaged, and strategically available as a counterweight to American regional influence. A succession that produces internal chaos, that accelerates military confrontation with Israel or the United States, or that results in Iranian nuclear weaponization and the international crisis that would follow. None of these outcomes serves Chinese interests, and Beijing's engagement with the Iranian succession process through its diplomatic channels reflects this calculation. What does the post-Khamenei Iran look like? This is the question that every actor with stakes in the Iranian situation is trying to answer. An honest analysis requires acknowledging that the answer is genuinely uncertain in ways that confident prediction cannot resolve. The Islamic Republic is not going to democratize because Khamenei dies. The institutional interests of the Revolutionary Guard, the religious establishment, and the networks of political and economic power that have been constructed within the system over 45 years of Islamic Republic governance are too entrenched, too invested in the system's continuation, and too hostile to the genuine political pluralism that democratization would require to permit that outcome, regardless of who becomes supreme leader. But the specific form of authoritarian governance that follows Khamenei could differ meaningfully from what preceded it in ways that matter for the international environment. The specific degree of Revolutionary Guard operational autonomy, the specific posture toward the nuclear threshold, the specific management of proxy network activity in the region, the specific calculation about whether engagement with the international community on sanctions relief and nuclear containment serves Iranian interests. All of these are variables that different successors would set differently, and the differences matter. The most important variable, the one whose setting will determine more of the answers to the other questions than any other single factor, is the relationship between the new supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guard. A supreme leader who owes his position entirely to Guard support, who has no independent religious legitimacy and no institutional base outside the Guard's patronage, will be a supreme leader whose policies reflect Guard institutional interests to a degree that Khamenei, who maintained at least some institutional independence from the Guard through his own political networks and his formal religious authority, never fully was. A Guard-captured supreme leader is the scenario that most concerns external actors, because the Revolutionary Guard's institutional interests in the nuclear program, in regional proxy activity, and in the specific confrontational posture toward Israel and Saudi Arabia are the interests most likely to push Iranian policy in the directions that the international community most wants to avoid. The health crisis is real. The succession is approaching. And the world that exists after it will be shaped by decisions being made right now in rooms that no outside observer has access to, by individuals whose calculations are informed by the specific internal political dynamics of a system that has spent 45 years perfecting the art of opacity. Khamenei built a system designed to outlast him. Whether it does, in the specific sense of maintaining the coherence and the strategic direction that his tenure established, or whether his departure creates the specific instability that authoritarian systems without genuine succession mechanisms always risk. That is the question whose answer will define the Middle East for the next generation. The health has crashed. The clock is running. And everything that the past 45 years of Iranian strategic behavior has built is now in the most uncertain moment of its existence.